Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Shane. How are you?
I'm good.
Well, thanks again for helping us out with the Lunch and Learn. We have a great group today. So I think a lot of people are really interested in LiDAR, and I'm glad you can tell us more about it.
My pleasure.
Great. I'm also going to make you a, let's see, a co-host. I think that allows you to let people in. I mean, you should be able to share your screen anyway, but I don't know. I just like to make our presenters co-hosts since they ought to have that status, I suppose. All right, we're getting quite a few people joining us, so I'm gonna just go ahead and admit people.
Okay.
But if you want to check anything out, or like I said, share your screen, and we'll be ready to go at noon.
Sounds good.
Well, it looks
So,
good on my end. Yep.
Barbara, which screen do you see? Do you see the one with the slide? It's just the slide?
I don't. Right now I'm seeing the main slide and also your next slide.
Let me swap this. How about now?
Yes, now I am seeing just the main presenter slide. So
Perfect.
that looks good to me.
Perfect.
And you're welcome to leave that up if you want. If that makes it easier, we can do that as well.
That's fine.
Okay.
And then when the talk gets going, I'm going to turn my camera off to save bandwidth and so that people can just focus on the presentation.
That sounds great. I often do that myself. So we'll do that.
Oops.
It is amazing the detail you can get on these LiDAR images.
Oh, absolutely.
It's really fun to check out. Especially from a historical perspective, to see the, previous land use or
Yep.
stone walls or things like that. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I show one example of that toward the end.
Okay. So for anybody who's joined us a little early, thank you. It makes it much easier for me to admit everybody if they're not all coming in right at the crack of noon. So I appreciate that. And feel free to grab a drink or get yourself settled. We'll start in about 5 minutes with the program. Well, thank you all for joining us out there. I see a lot of familiar names. So nice to kind of see your name listed. While the lunch and learns aren't as much fun as actually being together in one location, at least we can share some expertise and knowledge with our special guests. So I'm going to wait another minute or two before we get going with our guest speaker today. And just to remind you all that this program is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording tomorrow, along with any additional information or links that that might help you with our LiDAR program. Okay, everyone. Well, we might as well get started. I have just a few brief announcements as before we get going. My name is Barbara Richter, and I'm the Executive Director at the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions. And for those of you who don't know NHACC, we're a nonprofit organization focused on supporting local conservation commissions so that they can be effective in protecting the natural resources in their communities. So today's program is Learn About LiDAR, and we're joined today by Shane Csiki from the New Hampshire Geological Survey, and he's going to talk about how the LiDAR programs can assist conservation commissions in preserving their natural and cultural resources. Shane currently serves as the state geologist and director of the New Hampshire Geological Survey at the Department of Environmental Services. In this role, Shane administers the New Hampshire GS, which provides information about land, mineral, and water resources of the state to citizens and state and local governments. Prior to this role, Shane worked at New Hampshire GS, administering flood hazard activities and providing expertise as needed in New Hampshire. He holds a PhD from the University of Illinois, and he also has a Master's of Public Administration from the University of New Hampshire. So just a few quick items before we turn it over to Shane. We are, as I mentioned before, for those of you who just joined, we are recording and we will send out a link tomorrow. We do ask that all participants remain muted so that the audio quality is good for the rest of us here. We encourage you to ask questions, and you can do that by either raising your hand on the reaction button at the bottom or the chat box as well. And I'll be monitoring that chat box for Shane. So let's get going here. Shane, thank you again for joining us, and I'm looking forward to this presentation.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you for the invitation. Great to be with you this afternoon and talk about LiDAR and also the New Hampshire Geological Survey and some of the programs that we have that utilize LiDAR and how some of these programs that we have in the survey can assist the conservation commissions in their work. So it's great to be here. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn my camera off so that you can focus on the slides during the presentation instead of me. So I'm going to turn that off and dig right in here. This is the Conservation Commission LiDAR edition of the New Hampshire Geological Survey update. And as you can see, the two images that you have on the title slide here are of LiDAR, which we now have for the entire state of New Hampshire, that we've collected over the past, 10 to 13 years in cooperation with the United States Geological Survey and their LiDAR surveying programs. We've received several capital budget appropriations over the years to collect and amass the LiDAR data that we now have for the state of New Hampshire, which is high resolution elevation information of the landscape. And I'm going to show in this presentation some of the interesting and neat things that you can see using LiDAR, with a particular emphasis on the natural landscape and the natural earth forms of the landscape. So just to give you an overview of the New Hampshire Geological Survey, we are a unit of the Department of Environmental Services. We're part of the Office of the Commissioner, so we are not in one of the line divisions of the agency. We basically serve as a science support unit, not only for other programs throughout the Department of Environmental Services, but also throughout state government, and we provide technical assistance to local town officials, particularly over the years as it relates to flooding and flood hazards impacts. Our mission statement is in statute. It's in bold at the top of the screen there. And underneath that are some of our primary constituent programs that the New Hampshire Geological Survey has. What I've tried to do in this presentation is talk about a few of the key programs that we have that I think are of direct benefit and of interest to the work that the conservation commissions do, and sort of lay out the overview of what those programs are, what those programs do. And then I'm going to get into talking about LiDAR, what LiDAR is, show you some interesting features that you can see using LiDAR. And then I'm going to talk more about how our programs in the survey utilize this information in our work, which can serve our mission of providing technical information to the state and local government throughout the state. I just want to mention also that we've been in a drought, and we are the stewards of the New Hampshire groundwater level monitoring network, which has 30 wells across the state, which does, we monitor those monthly. So we have a understanding of water level information in the state. That data goes directly into making the national drought map every week that you see. Just thought I would mention that, given that we have been in a drought and are coming out of a drought. But without further ado, let me get in and talk about a few of our constituent programs that I think are of benefit to you and your work. One of the key programs that we have, which is the centerpiece of any state geological survey, is our geologic mapping program. Many of you are probably familiar with our geologic mapping products. We have a superficial geologic map of New Hampshire, which dates back to 1950. And that comprises the superficial materials of the state. Where do we have sand and gravel? Where do we have clays? Where do we have a finer material? How are they distributed? Where do we have river sediment, sediment that's formed and that rivers are reworking? And then we have our state bedrock map, which was updated last as a statewide basis in 1997. And this shows a distribution of our rocks and rock types across the state in their various ages, and what are the constituents of the minerals in those rocks. So these are maps that we have on a statewide basis. But what the program does is we receive funding from the United States Geological Survey every year to map the state on a finer scale, to map in more detail both the superficial and bedrock geology of the state of New Hampshire. You might be asking, I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with geologic maps, but just to provide you some updates on what a geologic map is. It basically represents the distribution of the different types of superficial materials and rock on the Earth's surface, as I mentioned in the previous slide. It maps them in our normal 3 dimensions, but it also includes the 4th dimension of time. So when we go out and perform geologic mapping, we receive the funding each year from the USGS. We have had over the years basically a cadre of contract geologic mappers, most of whom are retired geologists, mostly from universities in New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, who we provide contract money from the USGS, and they go out to a quadrangle a 7.5 minute by 7.5 minute quadrangle, and they basically walk and drive around as much of the quadrangle as they can and identify what are the superficial materials, how are they distributed, what are their spatial extents, and also, from the bedrock side, what are the rock types, where are faults located, and so on and so forth. And they're trying to reconstruct the history, the glacial history on the superficial side and the formation history of the rocks over time. These are all available for what we have mapped in paper form. We're currently engaged, as in every other state survey in the country, to migrate them into digital geodatabases to make these into a seamless geographic information system coverage. This is an example of the Melvin Village quadrangle map that we have on file on the screen here. These are status maps of our current, more fine-scaled quadrangle mapping in the state. At the top, in the center of the screen, is a map of our bedrock mapping status, and the bottom is our superficial mapping status. As you can see, we have made far more progress on the superficial mapping side, in part because that we have more mappers who are superficial geologic mappers than bedrock mappers, and also because there's been a lot of interest in understanding the superficial materials of the state to identify groundwater infiltration, groundwater aquifer mapping that our Drinking Water Groundwater Bureau does at DES, as well as reconstructing the glacial history of the state. We have not been as robust on the bedrock side, as you can see in the top map. However, we have had discussions with our Geologic Resources Advisory Committee about retooling some of our mapping priorities. And we're going to be in the process of trying to make a pivot to trying to focus more on our bedrock mapping, in addition to trying to complete our superficial geologic mapping. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and its connection to LiDAR at the end of this talk. And with more of a greater emphasis in southern New Hampshire, where we have more population and more issues of concern. So we're in the process of trying to make that pivot and trying to bring in more of our own staff moving forward to perform that mapping. But getting out in the field, it continues to be a key part of this work. What we do in geologic mapping is, I already mentioned, we go out in the field and basically walk as much as we can of it, drive around it. And in the bottom image that's Gorham. And we create these maps of geologic mapping units. So each one of those colored polygons you see on there is a map unit. On the center of the screen is the Androscoggin River. And you'll see, for example, map unit QAL. That basically means alluvium that was just deposited in quaternary time. So basically the time that the glaciers receded about 10,000 years ago from this area. Alluvium is basically sediment that the rivers reworked over time. And we can map alluvial fans, fan deposits, landslides. That's the red blotch you see at the bottom left. On the bedrock side, to upper left part of the screen, we map the rock types. We map the faults. So you can see that on the left. We collect samples to date the rocks, try to get their ages, to try to reconstruct when and how they were formed. There's been a lot of interest in trying to reconstruct the formation history of the White Mountains. And of course, LiDAR is a key element that we use in this mapping now that it's available for the entire state. So it's very easy now, for example, in this upper right image, you can very plainly see that in the upper right, you've got a river valley here, basically a area that was likely a glacial lake because of how flat it is. That's a feature that as the glaciers receded, you had glacial lakes that dotted the entire New Hampshire landscape. You can see here the Swift River Valley. So we're using LiDAR now before we go out in the field to make rough estimates of where some of our mapping units, like the alluvium, which is our river valleys, is located in draft delineations before we go actually out in the field and actually verify our draft delineations because of how precise the information is in LiDAR. Much of our LiDAR on the state is about 1 meter resolution. So it's very precise information in terms of elevation and in terms of the spatial space, your north and north, south, east, west directions. On the screen are just some uses of New Hampshire's geologic maps. I'm not going to read them all. You can read them on the screen. But these are examples of how our geologic maps have been used by both the applied and professional communities, both public and private sector over the years in New Hampshire. Both are official and bedrock geologic maps. We're currently in the process of trying to develop standardized map templates so that each geologic map in the future we make and compile has a similar look and feel to it so that you know exactly where on that map to look for information as you get it. There's been a lot of interest in translating these maps into PDF format so that they're readily available on DES's website. Rebecca LeCain, our outreach coordinator, has been working diligently since she started with us in 2021 to get all this information onto the DES website in our document library so that you can easily find our geologic maps and quickly download it and not have to contact us for a paper copy. We understand that our DES document library is a little clunky to navigate and get to the right map that you're looking for. But if you contact Rebecca and you go to our DES website, go to the New Hampshire Geological Survey's website, Rebecca's contact information is there. If you're looking for a geologic map, she can put you in touch and get you and navigate you to the right place for you to find. But all of our information is online. If you might need just a little help to get there, and we'll help you with that. Over the years, New Hampshire Geological Survey has been deeply involved in the statewide stream crossing and assessment initiative. After the Alstead flood in 2006, which cost the lives of 7 people, where a culvert catastrophically blew out, there has been legislative interest in assessing every culvert in the state to identify its future failure risk, to try to prioritize them to determine funding priorities and for municipalities to apply for funding. So we've worked with our Wetlands Bureau and other state agencies on this program. We have culverts continuing to blow out all the time, like we did in southwestern New Hampshire with thunderstorm rains they had last summer. So we have approximately 26,000 stream crossings in New Hampshire. We're currently in the process of trying to work to complete assessing them. We've assessed mostly in the southern and central part of the state. We want to try to complete assessments in northern western New Hampshire, try to identify where those old, damaged, and undersized culverts are throughout the entire state of New Hampshire. And there's a picture of the location where the culvert blew out in Alstead in 2005. That culvert was completely wiped clean. This information is useful for our National Hydrography Dataset maintenance. And this information is available on the New Hampshire Aquatic Restoration Mapper, which is available as a link off of DES's website. You can look at all the rankings of the culverts and their priorities in terms of their risk, as well as fish passage constriction situation. We are also the stewards of the National Hydrography Dataset, which is the national official geographic information system representation of the streams, as well as other water bodies like lakes and so on in the United States. But our focus is on stream networks. And a representation in New Hampshire's blue line stream network is in the image on the left. It provides the ability for a unique identification system and geometric framework. So we can place features on this network as events. So all of our stream crossing points that we assess as a for instance can be placed on this network as events. And the NHG allows you to do tracing. So if you have a specific question and you want to know what is upstream of there, what features are upstream, and you have them linked to the NHD, you can do tracing functions to identify what's upstream, what's downstream, what's the summation of different features upstream and downstream. We manage this as a stewardship agreement with the United States Geological Survey. Starting to make the transition to LiDAR, which is why you're all here now, I wanted to set the stage for a few of our programs and what they are so you have the understanding for much of the rest of the talk. Much of the current representation of the blue line stream network in the National Hydrography Dataset comes from these 1 to 24,000 scale topographic maps. So the entire United States was mapped by the USGS from from the 1800s all the way up to the late 1980s, the topography was on these old style topographic maps. And you can see these blue lines such as representing Danforth Brook and Newfound River over here. And those blue lines are derived from these 1 to 24,000 scale topographic maps. And that is what the National Hydrography Data Set, much of which still comes from these blue lines on these maps. That was Bristol. This is an image in LiDAR, which is high resolution topographic information, which is basically of the same area that you just viewed on the previous map. As you can very plainly see, there's a lot of additional detail on the landscape that you can see on the LiDAR that you cannot see on that old scale 1 to 24,000 scale topographic map. So if you just start taking a look on here, you can very plainly see there's a lot of features on here that are potentially streams. We don't know if they're streams or not streams, but you can see them all in the landscape here, draining the hills on the hillsides. And there's a lot more potential streams on here and on the landscape than are currently represented on that 1 to 24,000 scale topographic map, and therefore represented in the National Hydrography Data Set. So one of our projects, and it's a very long-term project, is to try to update the National Hydrography Data Set so that the Blue Line Network is more correctly representative of the actual stream network on the landscape rather than where it comes from that 1 to 24,000 scale topographic map. So we have been engaged with White Mountain National Forest the past few years with a project in the White Mountains to basically use GIS techniques and using the LiDAR to try to identify where are all of those additional streams that are on the stream network that are not currently represented in the 1 to 24,000 scale topographic maps and therefore in NHD currently. And the idea in the long term is to basically extract all these streams and then work with the USGS and White Mountain National Forest to try to get these into the National Hydrography Data Set so that you have a more representative network for purposes such as modeling flood risk, monitoring flood flows in a watershed, and I'll mention that a little later again, so that this network is as accurate as possible. So we have a grant with White Mountain National Forest through 2025 that we have the ability each summer to hire interns to go up and do field verifications of these locations to try to identify at low flow, are these a stream or not, and try to update this stream network. And in the long term, we'd like to try to take these techniques and expand it to a greater proportion of the state. So I've been showing you images of LiDAR and talking about LiDAR. So the question, of course, you may be asking is, what is LiDAR? Some of you have probably attended talks in the past that my predecessor, Rick Corman, the former state geologist, provided on LiDAR. And those of you who know Rick know that he really loved LiDAR. I'm not going to probably get as technical as he did in his previous talks. I'm just going to give you a summary of what LiDAR is. The best way to think of LiDAR is it's a bit like radar. So think of a weather radar and you look at the weather radar and the distribution of precipitation every time it's raining, or if we have thunderstorms coming through, and you check the radar to see where the thunderstorms are. LiDAR is analogous to radar, but the difference is that radar uses sound waves passing through the atmosphere to determine where the precipitation is. LiDAR uses light pulses that are basically an airplane that flies, and light pulses are constantly scattered to the ground, and then the returns are then measured by the unit on the plane to create a point cloud of where, what is the height of each feature on the land surface that is being received by the airplane. It can't see through leaves very well. It can see through regular trees. And that is why when you fly LiDAR, it's flown in the winter and after leaf off, but before the snow's on the ground. There are two types of LiDAR, red wavelength and green wavelength. Red wavelength LiDAR cannot see through water. and the LiDAR coverage we have for the entire state is red wavelength LiDAR. There is also green wavelength LiDAR. Green wavelength LiDAR can see through the water, and there are only a few locations in the United States that have green wavelength LiDAR data. In New Hampshire, we are fortunate enough that the Suncook River, east of Concord, has green wavelength LiDAR data, and that was to support the response to the Suncook River revulsion in the early 2010s. I'm not going to talk any more about green wavelength LiDAR, however, in this presentation. This image just shows is sort of a graphical way of explaining what I just showed in the verbalized in the previous slide. But basically, there is a ground GPS unit set up. The plane has a GPS unit, and through a lot of algorithms, all that data, those returns that are being received by the unit on the plane are all tied together with GPS, highly accurate global positioning system at the time the LiDAR data is flown in order to determine exactly where on the landscape all of those different returns are being received from. And so you're mapping everything in an XYZ space. So basically north-south on the map, east-west on the map, and up and down in terms of height on the landscape. So very much like radar, you know, the unit on the plane receives multiple returns and intensities of returns based on the height and type of information that it is, what is on the landscape that it's passing through at the time the LiDAR is being flown. So then what happens after all this data is collected, you basically have a point cloud of information. And then there is a company that the USGS has, which is it's a very specialized company that they have a contract with that basically has the software to take this gargantuan point cloud and use a lot of algorithms to lead to the creation of the topography of the land surface that is bare earth imagery that you see in these images today. Again, if you want to know more about LiDAR, there's a lot of technical discussions on the internet that talk about this. But I think in a good overview perspective, that is LiDAR, how it works, and how it leads to these nifty images that you can see on the landscape. Here's an example of Henniker. And I just randomly picked a town in New Hampshire and put it in here for this presentation. A couple of things really stand out. One thing is, if you compare this to an aerial image, you can see all the features on the landscape that you would never be able to see in an image. One of the striking things that you can see here is that on all the hillsides, you have this very, it's a very detailed alignment of features and almost like a scraping on the landscape that's aligned in a northwest to southeast direction, as north's at the top of the map. And that is the result of the advance of the glaciers, you know, 20, 30,000 years and more ago. When the last glacier, which receded from New Hampshire between 10 and 15,000 years ago, advanced across the landscape, the weight of that glacier pressed down upon the landscape and basically in the direction of the ice flow as it was proceeding southeast, molded the landscape as it did so. And you see these features all across the state of New Hampshire. You can also very clearly make out the Contucook River Valley, which is in the center of Henniker. Contucook River flows through the center of Henniker. You can very clearly make out the path of the river. You can also make out other paths in the floodplain of the Contucook River, which either demarcate previous, as the glaciers receded, meltwater channels, or paths where this river has been in the past, because rivers naturally migrate back and forth in their floodplains, as many of you know. So you can see a lot of features of the natural landscape by looking at LiDAR. You can see a similar image for the town of Meredith, and gave a presentation actually in collaboration with our former state geologist to the Meredith Historical Society back in May. So I've taken some of the slides from Meredith and put them in this presentation as they were available. But you can see the same features on the landscape in the town of Meredith and in surrounding towns. And you can see the the very clear mark of the glaciers on the landscape, and glaciers marks on the landscape is prevalent throughout the entire state of New Hampshire. When you go out in the field and you look on the landscape, you can, and look at an exposed rock, such as you can see here, you can very clearly see the, we call these striations. These are the marks in the rock that were placed there as the glaciers and their weight moved across the landscape and advanced. And you can see those, and they match what you see in the LiDAR today. There's other features we can see on the landscape. This is an example from the Csiki River in Rochester. And you can very clearly see where the valley of the Csiki River is, and it's surrounded by relatively flat topography to the east and west. That's the terrace of the Csiki River. And down here in the lower center right, I'm hoping you can see my mouse, you can see this feature, this indentation into the landscape right adjacent to Wilson Street. And that is actually a landslide, which occurred in 2010. After some very heavy rain, we had to go out and take a look at it. As you can see, it was directly adjacent to the properties and the homes there. Was very much of concern to the city of Rochester at the time. And you can see how clearly that shows up on the landscape. So you can see landslides, you can see river flow paths, you can see all kinds of things in LiDAR. And as you can see also in the image here, if you have even an indentation, as I'm showing here to the center right of this aerial LiDAR image, if you've got an indentation, a former footprint of a building that's not there anymore on the landscape, you can see that. You can see where all the houses are along all these different streets. You can see all these different human anthropogenic artifacts, cultural artifacts in the landscape, in addition to the natural ones. In Durham, for example, through here in this area, the glaciers receded 13 to 15,000 years or so ago, approximately. And every year the glacier receded, the glacial front was a little further north of where it was the previous year. And in Durham, you can actually see those ridges on the landscape. All of these lineal ridges, which trend from west to east, that are parallel to each other, are demarcations of where a glacier was each year compared to the previous year, as the glaciers melted and gradually the glacier front gradually receded, or its position moved from south to north as the glaciers receded. So you can very clearly see those in that LiDAR image. In Concord, the Merrimack River Valley, which is this big flat area here in the center of Concord, you know, all through here, it looks like something that's really smooth, and you could put your hand on it and be really nice and smooth. And then you've got, it's very clear the Merrimack River flows through the center of Concord. You can see all the different paths of the Merrimack River. The Merrimack River within its valley has very clearly flowed all over the place. When the glaciers receded, I talked about glacial lakes earlier, they would periodically leave piles of debris, piles of material that were rocks, sand, boulders, etc., within the river valleys. One such deposit, which created a dam, was down southeast of Nashua in the Merrimack River Valley down there. And it created what was called, as the glaciers receded about 10,000 years ago, Glacial Lake Merrimack. Glacial Lake Merrimack then backed up all through the Merrimack River Valley and up through Concord and up into Canterbury. And then you had glacial meltwater streams as the glaciers were melting, flowing into this glacial lake. And the end result was that you had a lot of sediment deposit in this lake, and it deposited in a flat profile as all these streams came in. And then at some point, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, approximately, they don't know exactly when, somewhere in that time frame, that dam down southeast of Nashua burst, drained Lake Merrimack, and exposed all this material. There was an ancient Merrimack River there. And then as the landscape started to move upward because under your feet because of the weight of the glaciers being removed, the Merrimack River started to downcut into these sediments. And that's the landscape you have today. So you can see that the Merrimack River, down cut into this old glacial lake sediments. And that was completed about 8,000 years ago, that's estimated. And then the Merrimack River's been flowing back and forth within that deposited area since that time. And if you look at aerial imagery, and you can see in the LiDAR here, the Merrimack River through time has been all over the place. As you can see in this image, compared to this image, and I'll toggle back and forth a couple times, you can see so much more in the LiDAR than you can in an aerial image. As a for instance, in Meredith, in the center of the screen here, you've got these hillsides that have been have the marks of the glaciers having molded the glacial till onto them. But you have in here an area of, it looks very hummocky. There's a lot of mounds in it, and they're very closely spaced together. That is an example of ablation till. What that is as the glaciers receded and moved across the landscape from northwest to southeast, they entrained into them a lot of the rock, the boulders, all the material that's on the Earth's surface that you see outside your window, and it entrained it up and caught it up into the glacier. So all that material, as the glaciers were here, was all contained in the glaciers. When the glaciers melted, and we found evidence in northern New Hampshire in our recent geologic mapping, there's a lot of questions of, did the glaciers actually retreat in the way you would think of it? It moved from southeast to northwest, or did they gradually melt down in place? That's an open question, but there are places where we know that the glaciers melted down in place, and all that sediment, that earth material that had been entrained into them from when the glaciers moved across the landscape and advanced, was basically deposited in place as the glaciers melted, and it leaves this hummocky terrain. Now, when that ablation till was mapped on the geologic map that was created for the Meredith area, we did not have the benefit of LiDAR at that time. But if you look at it now and you look at that map, you can very plainly see where that ablation till is. And that's actually a map unit we map on our geologic maps. And so this is an example of how you can use LiDAR today to aid the geologic maps that we create. Alluvial fans, one of my favorite. This is the Rattle River in Shelburne. As rivers come out of very confined valleys, if they come out of a very confined valley, such as the Rattle River, and then enter a very broad plain, such as the floodplain of the Androscoggin River, they will take their load of sediment, which is boulders, cobbles, rock, etc., and it will splay it out on the landscape like a fan, hence the name alluvial fan. And then over time, the Rattle River has moved back and forth across this fan, as you can see by all these channels on this alluvial fan. Whether or not some of those are from the time of the glaciers or modern is a question mark, but there's probably been some movement on this alluvial fan over time. There is an interesting feature on a property there that's this big circular feature. You can see in aerial imagery. We actually do not know what it is, but it has been a topic of conversation over time. We don't know if that is related to some feature that was put there because of the Portland Railroad. But you can see more than just the natural landscape in LiDAR. You can see the dam on the Androscoggin River here. You can see the modification in the landscape that was occurred to put in and install that dam, which is a hydropower dam on the Androscoggin River. This is Lake Waukewan. This is in Meredith. This purple area on the map here is a map unit. We mapped it as the Lake Waukewan deposit. What that is, and I'll go to the next slide so you can see it in the LiDAR. That's this area right here in the center of the screen in the south shore of Lake Waukewan. That is an area of basically thick glacial till, which was deposited when Lake Waukewan was at a higher elevation as the glaciers were melting. The Lake Winnipesaukee, as the glaciers receded and moved to the north, Lake Winnipesaukee actually drained to the south. It drained through the Mirror Meeting River Valley through Alton and Alton Bay. And then when the glaciers receded to the northwest, it got to a certain point where there was a nick point that was uncovered, and then Lake Winnipesaukee was able to drain southwest into the Merrimack as it does today. So the elevation of Lake Waukee was higher than it was today, and these flat deposits adjacent to the lake are from that era. And you can see there's a stream that flows into that area, and we did some stream crossing assessments on it. And I was actually out there one day when we did those stream crossing assessments. And this is what a stream looks like further up gradient in what is glacial till, which overlies much of New Hampshire. That's the material that the glaciers reworked on the landscape outside of our river valleys over much of the state. This is what a typical New Hampshire river looks like. And then this is what it looks like in the Lake Waukee deposit. And it's full of clay. And this is at a stream crossing assessment site. And the mud is so thick that it was up to my knees, and I had to have people help pull me out when I had my waders on. So that was, and you can see the water level's been up in the past. You can see the sediment on the leaves there. But the LiDAR really shows really well where these areas are. So it's much easier to go out and map and also know ahead of time what's on the landscape. And this is just another example to show you the difference between what you can and can't see on aerial imagery and what you can and can't see in LiDAR. The LiDAR is clearly much more detailed, and you can see all kinds of things on the LiDAR that you could never see on the aerial imagery. And from the perspective of geologic mapping, this has been a revolution to our geologic mapping efforts in the state. Stepping away from just geologic mapping and just for some interest, this is the Ashwaylet River in Gilsum, flows to the west into Surrey and then down into Keene. You can very plainly see the height of the terrace here above the Ashwaylet River floodplain. The Ashwaylet River, no doubt, over time has gradually downcut into this previous deposition of what's most likely former lake, glacial lake material. And within the Ashwaylet River floodplain here, and you can plainly see these different channels. Some of the channels are branching off of the main stem of the Ashwaylet River, which is you can plainly see flowing through here. And you can very plainly see that the Ashwaylet River it's moved around over time, as most rivers do in our state, and given enough time. And you can see that by these former channels that the river has occupied. And you can very plainly see where all those channels are in LiDAR. So if you're doing a flood hazards assessment, it's very easy to make some estimations, better estimations of, how active has this river been or not. You can see this also from Woodstock. Coming in from the left here is Moosilauke Brook, i.e. known as Lost River, though Lost River is not its official name. It's Moosilauke Brook. And you can see the floodplain here. You can see the floodplain coming in of the east branch of the Pemigewasset. You can see that's Lincoln here. Another example of the features, the wastewater treatment ponds in Lincoln. You can very plainly see those on the landscape, right directly adjacent to the east branch of the Pemigewasset. You can see Interstate 93 very clearly on the landscape, the roads, the bridges. And as I mentioned earlier, if you zoom in even more, you can see houses, tops of houses, etc. And you can see very plainly how active just from all the flow paths, the Pemigewasset River system has been over time. To tie this back to the New Hampshire hydrography data set that we maintain, one of the problems that we have with our blue line network of streams is that the blue line network, when you lay it down on LiDAR, there's a mismatch. The LiDAR very clearly shows where the streams on our landscape are located. And then you have this blue line network, which represents as representations from those older topographic maps that's not aligned. And this yellow dot here is a stream crossing assessment point. And this location here that's been sort of carved out of the road in LiDAR is where the actual stream is located. And you can very plainly see that this blue line is not aligned there. And if you're going to do very detailed flow routing modeling in a watershed, that's a problem because if you want a really accurate, precise answer, you will get a good approximation from the existing blue line network, but that blue line network is not actually representative of exactly where that river or stream is located. So in order to help get the LiDAR ready to use the LiDAR to engage in, let's say, flood modeling or flood routing in the future, we do a process what's called hydro enforcement, which is basically when we get the LiDAR information from the LiDAR scan, you'll have a road here, you've got a stream here, and the road is basically acts like a dam on that river. So if you were to use the LiDAR elevation information for flow modeling or flood routing, it would function as a dam and you'd have a nice big lake on the upstream side here to the left. So what we have to do is we have to use other data sets, such as our stream crossing data, or where you can very plainly see where the river or stream is on the landscape. And you basically have to, quote unquote, burn a path into the LiDAR so that you have a space there that is an accurate representation of the flow path of a water body through where that road crossing is. So if you're doing elevation modeling or you're doing a ponding analysis of where could an undersized culvert store water, you're able to route the water through there without the road functioning as a dam. And we have to do this throughout the entire state with this information. A couple of even more egregious examples. This is in Carroll. There's a couple of streams, tributaries coming in here. And then at the bottom of the screen, this is the Ammonoosuc River. You can very plainly see in LiDAR exactly where it is. And you can see the blue line representation of the Ammonoosuc River. You can see that the mismatch is huge, and we have these problems all over the state. You can see that the blue line of the streams, coming in is not aligned with where the culvert and the channel actually is. These are all the types of problems that we're trying to address in the work that we're doing with the White Mountain National Forest, and eventually want to take on a statewide basis, and that we're working with the United States Geological Survey on. As you can probably gather, with an entire state's worth of these kinds of issues, this is a major undertaking, and it's something that we have to peck away at because, as you can imagine, we have limited resources, and there's only so many people, so many hours in the day, but it is a major problem. With our stream crossing data, we also, once the data is collected, goes through our quality control process, and we have it in our statewide database. Brian in our office runs them through a StreamWorks TU hydraulic vulnerability model. And what that does is it basically, for each stream crossing, with the data we collect in the field, plus information on the attributes of the contributing watershed, upstream of that culvert, we identify what is the, whether it's, what will be the risk of that culvert being able to pass a specific flow or overtop or not be able to pass a flow, whereas the water flows across the road and the culvert cannot pass the water. We do that for the two-year flow event for that site, 10, 25, 50, and 100 years. And we model all this. A lot of the hydrologic inputs is dependent on the longest flow paths, the flow paths that come into that culvert from the upstream watershed. To make this modeling as accurate as possible, it's important to have an accurate flow line network that's actually representative of the actual streams that are on the landscape rather than what comes from the topographic maps. So if you look at the blue line network from the topographic maps, the total length is going to be shorter than it will be from LiDAR, because the LiDAR is more representative of what's actually there and captures more of the bends and rivers and streams than the old blue line network does. And I think the last couple of examples I showed illustrate that. That data, by the way, the hydraulic vulnerability data, is also available on the New Hampshire Aquatic Restoration Mapper. I've talked about some of the cultural and anthropogenic features you can see on the landscape. This is Peterborough. And again, you can see, if you look closely, you can see the buildings in town. You can see the houses on the streets in Peterborough. You can see areas like in the upper northwest corner here, is north is to the up top of the screen, you know, where the landscape has been modified over the years for, you know, either house building or gravel excavation. All of those different features show up. The roads show up, the driveways show up. And if you look toward the lower left of the screen, or the southwest part of this image, and you look very closely on some of the hills to the left, on the left center of the screen, you can see some of these very fine lines, these very fine scale lines on the landscape. And those are not roads, they're not water pipes, those are stone walls. And I believe some of you are familiar with the stone wall mapping initiative that the former state geologist Rick Corman started back when he was here, to try to, through a crowdsourced application, entreat the citizens across New Hampshire and others interested in stone walls to use LiDAR and engage with the LiDAR to map the locations of all these stone walls in the state. So you can see those on LiDAR as well. And you know, there's all kinds of features that you can see on LiDAR, that are not only of aid to the natural landscape that's of importance to our work in the Geological Survey, but also that's of interest to you know, citizens who have an interest in things such as stone walls. There's also, we didn't pursue it, of course, because we have only so much staff and ability to do things. But there's people out there who are interested in using LiDAR to identify cellar holes and other historical artifacts, grave mounds, that type of thing, that it can be used for. And LiDAR was used in North Carolina, for instance, to identify locations of old grave mounds and burial sites. So I'm going to wrap this talk up and open up for questions, with ending by I'll give you a little sneak peek of sort of where the next steps on superficial geologic mapping are in the state. So as part of our geologic mapping program, we have a Geologic Resources Advisory Committee, which is required. It's a USGS requirement where they have to set our mapping priorities, and they have to vote on our mapping proposals every year. One of the things they've recently indicated is that they would very much like us to see us complete our superficial geologic mapping in the state at these quadrangle 1/24,000 quadrangle scales. If you look at New Hampshire compared to every other New England state, in terms of the proportion of our land area that's been mapped, New Hampshire actually leads New England in terms of the proportion of the state that's been mapped at a finer scale for superficial geology. The challenge we have is our cadre of geologic mappers is entering second retirement. They're mostly retired geologic mappers. They're in the process of retiring for good. And so we're going to have fewer mappers on contract moving forward. That leaves our own staff within the survey, which is basically 2 individuals who can continue to do superficial geologic mapping. And the question becomes, how can we do superficial geologic mapping in a way that is efficient, but that is also accurate and also completes the state in a timely manner, because the USGS would also like to see the state completed because of their interest. So we also have a big hole in the northern part of the state, which is very remote and many parts are roadless, as you can see by this LiDAR image of Pittsburgh at the northernmost part of New Hampshire. Enter LiDAR. The USGS, although there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, the USGS has been engaged in trying to use machine learning techniques to try to train the computer to read LiDAR information and based on comparing it to other maps that have been made in the past, this is work that's been done in Maine, trying to have the computer make a first delineation of geologic map units. There's been mixed success on that, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that. There's other techniques from master's thesis that have been come out in recent years of how to use the boundaries of the landscape features in LiDAR to make first passes of geologic map units and make good estimations of what those units are likely to be based on our experiences elsewhere in the state, and then go out and, where we can, perform field checks to try to, check and verify those original delineations that are done using LiDAR at a desktop in the office. This is a lot of work ahead in terms of trying to figure out the right method and to make those methods accurate. It's something that we're going to be starting to look at more in earnest in the spring in preparation for our future maps. But this is a national conversation now. It's been a conversation among the 6 New England state geologists and the USGS. So this is sort of, the next step of, how we're going to be trying to use this LiDAR information to aid in our geologic mapping. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shane. That was really very, very interesting. It's great to hear what's happening with LiDAR and how it's going to be used. We do have a couple questions for you. So I wanted to ask, the first one was from Helen Frink. She said, where can we access LiDAR maps by town? And a lot of this information, I'd be happy to include those links in the follow-up email.
Thanks for the question. So what I can do is I can provide links to Barbara and she can distribute it. But to answer your question, Helen, let me turn my camera on so you can see me. To answer your question, Helen, the LiDAR, all the LiDAR data, as well as the hill shades, which provides these nice images that you've seen in this presentation, are available via New Hampshire Granite, which is the statewide GIS clearinghouse. You can go right there. They've got a LiDAR page. They have a web viewer. It's all there.
Yep, great. And the other question is, will New Hampshire use LiDAR as the base map for the upgraded geologic maps? Oregon does this and it makes the maps look really great.
Yes, we have already started doing that on our last rendition of geologic maps, certainly on the superficial side. Obviously, the primary purpose of the map is geologic map units, but if you look closely underneath it, the LiDAR elevation is present on those maps.
Okay, great. And then the other question is, how often will this data be updated in the future?
That's another good question. So this LiDAR data was collected as a collaboration between USGS and the state of New Hampshire. On the state side, we put up capital budget appropriation funds that served as the match for the federal funds. New Hampshire's been completed. USGS now is working to complete many states, such as Nevada, for instance, that do not have nearly as much of the state completed for LiDAR as the New England states. So the USGS's goal now is to complete this elevation data collection for the entire country before starting to revisit flying it again. So I can't give you an exact number, but I would hazard a guess of greater than 5 years at the very least.
Okay, that's not too bad. And then we have another question about how they take the photos or how LiDAR is used. Is the LiDAR directional, direct down? And I guess that's how are they getting the shadows?
So the plane, basically the plane is flying over the landscape. So I could show you another map that shows the flight paths of the LiDAR over the landscape. And if you were to see those, they are very, very closely spaced together. So they're basically these very tightly packed lines, and the plane flies along each line, completes a line, does a loop, starts the next line. So they're basically, you've got this unit looking down at the landscape and sending out the laser, the light pulse, and then getting the returns from it. So you have to be very close to, looking down in order to get good, accurate readings. And so I could show you a map that shows all the flight paths. They're very closely spaced.
Okay, that's cool. Are there any other questions out there? People are welcome to unmute and ask anything. We have just a minute or so to go, but it's fascinating information and really, really helpful, I think, for conservation commissions to know about. And as we mentioned, we'll make sure that you have those links to get this information and the aquatic resource mappers and other link that we'll provide in that follow-up email.
Barbara and Shane, this is Sandy. I have one question about Shane mentioned the how LiDAR doesn't see through leaves very well, but I guess I understand that it's actually been used to look at like heights of vegetation to classify wetland types. So I was wanted to know if Shane would address that.
So, hi, Sandy. Good
Hi.
to see you. So basically, the primary purpose of the flying the primary outcome of the LiDAR that was flown through the USGS was to get the topography. So because of that, the purpose was it needed to be flown leaf off in order to maximize the ability for the laser light pulse to get down to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens as that information is collected, it results in a point cloud. So we have reams of disks of data from where the LiDAR has been flown that have all the height information of the different features on the landscape. And if that's something you want to explore more, we could have a conversation offline.
Yeah, no, I know the DES contractor, Ducks Unlimited, used that height data, I understand, to help classify wetlands like scrub shrub versus trees,
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
forested.
yeah.
So that's why I was curious, but yeah, thank you for that explanation.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Shane. This was, again, very, very interesting. And there's a lot more out there. So we will make sure that the link that's sent out tomorrow includes the recording as well as other resources that we talked about today in the program. And I will also include Shane's contact information if you want to ask a question directly to him. So again, thank you all for joining us. And you're welcome to share these recordings with the rest of your Conservation Commission if they'd like to learn more about LiDAR. And Shane, thanks again. Everybody have a great afternoon.